and he died in the year 1993 when he was 52 years old of prostate cancer. So Zappa first started playing music when he was learning the drums when he was 12 years old, and this was the beginning of his journey into the musical, like all aspects of the musical realm that he continued to explore later on in his life. And somebody that he encountered early on was a composer named Edgar Varese, who he was kind of critics did not like his music very much because it was kind of just random noises and it seemed too experimental for them. And Frank Zappa really latched onto this, and it influenced his style of making music for a lot of his life. So he went on to have a very productive career making music in all sorts of different styles. He made classical music, rock music, and he also was very active in just creating art as well as politics, like policies inside the USA as well as foreign policies he was quite active in.
All right, so now that Bjorn's talked with you a little bit about who he was, let's talk about the film itself. So some background on the film: director Alex Winter, when he was coming into this, he recognized that in the past there have been different documentaries and different films made on the life of Frank Zappa, but he had access to something that they didn't. This film gets a lot of its footage from Zappa's own personal archives that he had over the years. And this footage includes anything from home movies he made and edited as a kid with film, splicing things together, whatever he could get his hands on, to different performances he had over the years, different jam sessions with people that would come over to his house, guys like Eddie Van Halen, just anybody like that. And it even included music he'd worked on days before his death. So this is a wide variety of footage and archives that he had that Alex Winter had to pull from. And this documentary also features lots of interviews from his family and the different musicians he'd worked with that knew him better than anybody ever had. And it took Alex Winter 6 years to go through all this footage that Zappa had amassed and piece them together in what became Zappa. And so right here, we got a little look at just the sheer size of his archives. This was a massive room in his house that was just filled with footage that Winter had to go through and sort through. And there's so much stuff that I can't imagine what he found going through there.
Pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, moving on to the central message. I think this quote that we found from the director Alex Winter, which you can see in the top right corner, really describes I think what he was trying to capture when he made the film, which is that he was much more than this groovy mustachioed guitar guy. So I think a lot of people, I know for myself, before I really listened to his music and dug deeper into his life, I knew of Frank Zappa, but I just imagined him as this 60s and 70s kind of wacky guitar player that just made this crazy music that wasn't that special, and it was just it was unique, but it was not anything groundbreaking in the realm of music, and I wasn't aware of everything he had done outside of rock music. So I think this was what the film was trying to capture because of I think the general public, how they perceive Frank Zappa is different than everything that he really accomplished. So, I mean, early on he was composing film scores for movies. He created all sorts of orchestral music for full symphonies. I mean, he worked with the London Symphony Orchestra. Like Kyle just talked about, he made home movies in his spare time when he was younger, and he made a lot of art, and also was would pay other people to kind of create art, little claymation movies that kind of fit with his whole persona that he was building and the music that he was making. That also includes all of the album covers. He was very active in that. Early on, he made his own album covers, and then later he moved it to other people, but he was still very involved in that. He also was very active in politics, especially when there were organizations trying to censor lyrics. He was a big contributor for more freedom of speech and freedom of expression for musicians.
Mm-hmm.
So he was pretty pivotal in that. And then also a significant part, political thing that he was involved with outside of the U.S. was when the Soviet Union left Czechoslovakia. He was very involved in supporting those people as they moved on to a new era in their country, and he eventually became, what was the foreign trade?
Yeah, like the trade ambassador to the United
Yeah,
States.
a really important position with the United States from the Czechoslovakian side. So he knew what he knew what he wanted in music and life, especially music. He really knew what he wanted, and he had this really strict vision, and he would do anything it takes to accomplish that vision. So that's kind of what I think the documentary is getting at, is just like we said, there's a lot more to him than meets the eye or that you might realize at first notice. Okay, in terms of critical acclaim, the film was generally pretty well received. I read a lot of good reviews, and just by fans as well as critical reviews, those were mostly positive. I think pretty much the general consensus was that it captured his life pretty accurately and all of the influence that he had in the various facets that he entered. But that said, there were some criticisms that I read. One of these being that it was too focused on his orchestral music and some of the things that he did rather than the rock music, which is what he's well known for, which is understandable because it might not appeal to as wide of an audience. But I think with keeping in mind the central message of the film, I think it's really important to focus on those other parts that he wasn't as well known for. Yeah, some sources also claimed that they didn't focus enough on his backing musicians, who Zappa pushed really hard to create this perfect music that he had in his head. And obviously that takes some pretty immense talent. And so there wasn't, I mean, it interviewed quite a few of the different artists, but there wasn't really enough focus on that, which I think it focused on some, but there definitely could have been more about that. And also there was a lot of like criticism of Zappa's music was about his lyrics and kind of the questionable subject matter. So, and that was talked about in the film, but not, I think it didn't put enough focus on like how that was received by fans at the time and what impact that made. And also this movie was nominated for five different awards. It didn't win any, but I think being nominated is pretty good achievement. And as you can see on the bottom, all of the different rating services rated it fairly highly. So
okay, so trying to connect this film to kind of what we've talked about in class. So first off, the idea of rebelling in rock music. This is really what Frank Zappa's calling card was. He was not necessarily what counterculture was seen as, but he was so fixated. His main mission was to just do what was right and what was different in his eyes. And he was so unique from everybody else from this perspective. And so in his music, there's this big recurring theme of rebellion in the different generations of rock music, and just the ideas of rebellion as a whole, whether it's from parents, pop culture, all that stuff. It was just so different from kind of anything else out there. And just a good example of this was one of his albums where it was, what was the album where they parodied the Beatles? What was that one called?
Oh, We're in it for the money.
Yeah, We're in it for the money. They completely parodied and was, would you say, making fun of the Beatles with that album cover? The Sgt. Pepper album cover?
I wouldn't say making fun, but
there was a commentary on it.
Yeah.
There was a sense of commentary on it, trying to rebel against the idea of what the music culture was there. And so that's really what Frank Zappa was known for, being such a unique man.
Yeah, I'd say he was pretty active in like kind of commentary on American culture in general, and kind of like trying to move away from that and stay on his own kind of way of like not really caring what other people were doing.
Yeah, and another good example of that too was he had a dispute with Warner Brothers later in his career where they just wanted to control him, but he was the kind of guy that you don't control and you don't even try to. And he created his own record label out of that, and they were pretty successful.
Yeah.
So he was one of a kind, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so another connection that we found with Frank Zappa that this movie talked about was the drug culture at the time, and kind of the idea of the Haight-Ashbury drug culture. But this didn't fit Frank Zappa. This was kind of the box I think the outside tries to place him into because of how different and unique his music and he was. Even though he wasn't part of this drug culture, he hadn't taken drugs, he hadn't partaken in that, but it was so different, it felt like it belonged there, even though he wasn't part of that. And so This was another example of how people just tried to fit him in boxes that he didn't belong in just because of how different he was. Like, it's so hard to put your finger on who Frank Zappa really was. And I think this documentary did a really good job showing him the man to understand who he was instead of just putting him in different boxes trying to understand from there.
Yeah, that's our presentation.
Yeah, that's Zappa 2020 by Alex Winter.
Yep.